is it 12 o'clock already? And here I am. And apparently it's Christmas. As you can see, we have a Christmas tree, and we have stockings. Oh, wait! And Sock Monkey's here. Sock Monkey is here, and Sock Monkey is here, and he is dressed as Santa Claus. So, yes, we're totally doing... So, we're going to read a chapter, again, from, I'm just trying not to make a mess here, Little House in the Big Woods, the chapter called Christmas. And I had to be careful with my sleeve because, you see, in the book, they make molasses snow candy. And I made some! It's you get a pan of crushed ice. Not like snow. I used my ice crusher and made crushed ice. And then I made, all the stuff, it's molasses and sugar. And you wouldn't think you'd need to add sugar to molasses, but real pure molasses is really bitter and harsh. So, Sock Monkey, take a seat. And we have the book. And, of course, we have the bonnet. Now, the crazy thing here is this stuff takes place in the 1870s, which are strikingly different from our time now. And the books came out in the 1930s during the Great Depression when people were nostalgic for the 70s, the 1870s. And, I mean, by the time she wrote these, people had refrigerators and cars and radio and electricity. And so they were like, ooh, the 1870s. And they're stuffing, as some people noticed yesterday, some of the things were quite violent. And there were some things going on that were like, you what? And that's the thing. Even in the 1930s when this came out, there were things in here that people went, whoa. People did that in the 1870s, huh? That's it. So, yeah, it's even more shocking now. And I say that because I'm to read some delightful things where people do stuff that will make you go, what? What? But it was the 1870s. What can I do? All right. Little House in the Big Woods. Christmas. Got your cocoa for me. Christmas was coming. The little log house was almost buried in snow. Great drifts were banked against the walls and windows, and in the morning, when Pa opened the door, there was a wall of snow as high as Laura's head. Pa took the shovel and shoveled it away, and then he shoveled a path to the barn where the horses and the cows were snug and warm in their stalls. The days were clear and bright. Laura and Mary stood on chairs by the window and looked out across the glittering snow at the glittering trees. Snow was piled all along their bare, dark branches, and it sparkled in the sunshine. Icicles hung from the eaves of the house to the snowbanks. Great icicles as large as the top of Laura's arm. Bicep. Icicles the size of your bicep. They were like glass and full of sharp lights. Pa's breath hung in the air like smoke when he came along the path from the barn. He breathed it out in clouds, and it froze in white frost on his mustache and beard. When he came in, stamping the snow from his boots, and caught Laura up in a bear's hug against his cold big coat. His mustache was beaded with little drops of melting frost. Every night he was busy, working on a large piece of board and two small pieces. He whittled them with his knife. He rubbed them with sandpaper with the palms of his hand until when Laura touched them, they felt soft and smooth as silk. Then, with his sharp jackknife, he worked at them, cutting the edges of the large one into little peaks and towers, with a large star carved on the very tallest point. He cut little holes through the wood. He cut the holes in the shape of windows and little stars and crescent moons and circles. All around them, he carved tiny leaves and flowers and birds. One of the little boards he shaped in a lovely curve, and around its edges he carved leaves and flowers and stars, and through it he cut crescent moons and curlicues. Curlicues, he did. Around the edges of the smallest board, he carved a tiny flowering vine. He made the tiniest shavings, cutting very slowly and carefully, making whatever he thought would be pretty. At last, he had the pieces finished, and one night he fitted them together. When this was done, the large piece was a beautifully carved back for a smooth little shelf across the middle. The large star was at the very top of it. The curved piece supported the shelf underneath, and it was carved beautifully too, and the little vine ran around the edge of the shelf. Pa had made this bracket for a Christmas present for Ma. He hung it carefully against the log wall between the windows, and Ma stood her little China woman on the shelf. China doll. The little China doll. There it is. The little China woman had a China bonnet on her head, and China curls hung against her China neck. Her China dress was laced across in front, and she wore a pale pink China apron and little gilt China shoes. Little shoes. Tiny shoes. She was beautiful, standing on the shelf with flowers and leaves and birds and moons carved all around her, and the large star at the very top. Ma was busy all day long cooking good things for Christmas. She baked salt-rising bread. Yes, salt! Salt is back. You know, some of the grown-ups could conceivably do a drinking game here that if every time someone said salt, because I don't know why the salt, but the 1800s salt was big. So she made, indeed, salt-rising bread and Ryan Injun bread and Swedish crackers and a huge pan of baked beans, yum, with salt pork, yes, and molasses. She baked vinegar pies. Ew. But you know, if you don't have anything, and this may be something that may come up, you know how you might make like a pecan pie with that clear jelly stuff or like a lemon meringue pie? You can make a vinegar pie. Okay, it takes obviously a lot of sugar to make the vinegar not be icky, but you can make a vinegar pie. It's a thing. So vinegar pie and dried apple pies, yum, and filled a big jar with cookies, and she let Laura and Mary lick the cake spoon. One morning, she boiled molasses and sugar together until they made a thick syrup. And you need the sugar, you really do. And Pa brought in 2 pans of clean white snow from the outdoors, or from your Hawaiian ice maker. Laura and Mary each had a pan, and Pa and Ma showed them how to pour the dark syrup into little streams on the snow. This is like stuck in here. It's like clotted. I can't do anything with it. They made circles and curlicues and squiggly things, and these hardened at once and were candy. And they do. It really does. Laura and Mary might eat 1 piece each, but the rest was saved for Christmas Day. All this was done because Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins, Peter and Alice and Ella, were coming to spend Christmas. The day before Christmas they came. Laura and Mary heard the gay ringing of sleigh bells, growing louder every moment, and then the big bobsled came out of the woods and drove up to the gate. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter and the cousins were in it all covered up under blankets and robes and buffalo skins. It was very cold. They were wrapped up in so many coats and mufflers and veils and shawls that they looked like big shapeless bundles. When they all came in, the little house was full and running over. Black Susan, the kitty from yesterday, little Black Susan ran out and hid in the barn, but Jack leaped in circles throughout the snow, barking as though he would never stop. Now there were cousins to play with. As soon as Aunt Eliza had unwrapped them, Peter and Alice and Ella and Laura and Mary began to run and shout. At last, Aunt Eliza told them to be quiet. Then Alice said, "I'll tell you what let's do." She said that. What let's do? I know what let's do. Let's make pictures. It's 1800s. What the heck? Alice said they must go outdoors to do it, and Ma thought it was too cold for Laura to play outdoors, but when she saw how disappointed Laura was, she said she might go after all for a little while. She put on Laura's coat and mittens and the warm cape with the hood and wrapped a muffler around her neck and let her go. Laura had never had so much fun. All morning, she played outdoors in the snow with Alice and Ella and Peter and Mary, making pictures. How did they do that? The way they did it was this. Each one, by herself, climbed up on a stump, and then all at once, holding their arms out wide, they fell off the stumps into the soft, deep snow. They fell flat on their faces. Then they tried to get up without spoiling the marks they made when they fell. If they did it well, there in the snow were 5 holes shaped almost exactly like 4 little girls and a boy, arms and legs and all. They called these their pictures. I'm not kidding. See, they did this. So this was a game where people threw themselves off a stump face first into the snow and dirt where there might be large rocks. This is called Don't Try This at Home. This is with the 1800s. People did this. You don't really want to try this at home because this is actually really dangerous and you could hurt yourself. You want to make sure there's a big snowbank. But they did. They just went boom and they made the little snow things. Well, they played so hard all day that when night came, they were too excited to sleep. But they must sleep or Santa Claus would not come. So they hung their stockings by the fireplace. We hung their stockings and then said their prayers and went to bed. Alice and Ella and Mary and Laura all in one big bed on the floor. Peter had the trundle bed. Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter were going to sleep in the big bed, and another bed was made on the attic floor for Pa and Ma. The buffalo robes and all the blankets had been brought in from Uncle Peter's sled, so there were enough covers for everybody. Good. Pa and Ma and Aunt Eliza and Uncle Peter sat by the fire talking. And just as Laura was drifting off to sleep, she heard Uncle Peter say, Eliza had a narrow squeak the other day when I was away at Lake City. You know Prince, the big dog of mine? Laura was wide awake at once. She always liked to hear about dogs. She lay still as a mouse and looked at the firelight flickering in the log walls and listened to Uncle Peter. Well, Uncle Peter said, early in the morning, Eliza started to the spring to get a pail of water, and Prince was following her. She got to the edge of the ravine where the path goes down to the spring, and all of a sudden, Prince set his teeth in the back of her skirt and pulled. Ow! You know what a big dog he is. Eliza scolded him, but he wouldn't let go, and he's so big and strong she couldn't get away from him. He kept backing and pulling till he tore a piece out of her skirt. It was my blueprint, Aunt Eliza said to Ma. Dear me, said Ma. He tore a big piece right out of the back of it, Aunt Eliza said. I was so mad I could have whipped him for it, but he growled at me. Prince growled at you? Pa said. Yes, said Aunt Eliza. So then she started on again toward the spring, Uncle Peter went on, but Prince jumped into the path ahead of her and snarled at her. He paid no attention to her talking and scolding. He just kept on showing his teeth and snarling, and when she tried to get past him, he kept in front of her and snapped at her. That scared her. I should think it would, Ma said. He was so savage, I thought he was going to bite me, said Aunt Eliza. I believe he would have. I never heard of such a thing, said Ma. What on earth did you do? I turned right around, and I ran into the house where the children were and slammed the door, Aunt Eliza answered. Of course, Prince was savage with strangers, said Uncle Peter, but he was always so kind to Eliza and the children. I felt perfectly safe to leave them with him. Eliza couldn't understand it at all. So, again, we're into a thing with animals biting people and dogs and panthers and wolves and bears, and we're into the arr stuff. Again, this happens a lot. Okay. After she got into the home, he kept pacing around and growling. Every time she started to open the door, he jumped at her and snarled. Had he gone mad? Asked Ma. Well, that's what I thought, Aunt Eliza said. I didn't know what to do. There I was, shut up in the house with the children, not daring to go out. And we didn't have any water. I couldn't even get any snow to melt. Every time I opened the door so much as a crack, Prince acted like he would tear me to pieces. How long did this go on? Pa asked. Well, about 4 pages by my count. All day, till late in the afternoon, Aunt Eliza said. Peter had taken the gun, or I would have shot him. Along late in the afternoon, Uncle Peter said, he got quiet and lay down in front of the door. Eliza thought he was asleep, and she made up her mind to try to slip past him and get to the spring for some water. So she opened the door very quietly, but of course he woke up right away. When he saw she had the water pail in her hand, he got up and walked ahead of her to the spring. Just the same as usual, and there, all around the spring in the snow, were the fresh tracks of a panther. The tracks were as big as my hand, said Aunt Eliza. Yes, Uncle Peter said. He was a big fellow. His tracks were the biggest I ever saw. He would have got Eliza sure if Prince had let her go to the spring in the morning. I saw the tracks. He had been lying up in that big oak over the spring, waiting for some animal to come there for water. Undoubtedly, he would have dropped down on her. Night was coming on when she saw the tracks, and she didn't waste any time getting back to the house with her pail of water. Prince followed close behind her, looking back into the ravine now and then. I took him into the house with me, Aunt Eliza said, and we all stayed inside till Peter came home. Did you get him? Pa asked Uncle Peter. No, Uncle Peter said. I took my gun and hunted all around the place, but I couldn't find him. I saw some more of his tracks. He'd gone on north, farther into the big woods. Alison, Ella, and Mary were all wide awake now, and Laura put her head under the covers and whispered to Alice, My, weren't you scared? Alice whispered back that she was scared, but Ella was scareder. Scareder. And Ella whispered that she wasn't either any such thing. Well, anyway, you made more fuss about being thirsty, Alice whispered. They lay there whispering about it until Ma said, Charles, those children will never get to sleep unless you play for them. So Pa got his fiddle. The room was still and warm and full of firelight. Ma's shadow and Aunt Eliza's and Uncle Peter's were big and quivering on the walls in the flickering firelight, and Pa's fiddle sang merrily to itself. It sang Money Musk and The Red Heifer, The Devil's Dream and Arkansas Traveler, and Laura went to sleep while Pa and the fiddle were both softly singing. Oh, who gets mentioned? My darling Nellie Gray, they have taken you away, and I'll never see my darling any more. I'm not quite sure what the implications of those lyrics are. It doesn't sound very fun, happy Christmas song. It sounds kind of terrifying, but there you go. In the morning, they all woke up almost at the same moment. They looked at their stockings, and something was in them. Santa Claus had been there. Alice and Ella and Laura in their red flannel nightgowns, and Peter in his red flannel nightshirt all ran shouting to see what he had brought. In each stocking there was a pair of bright red mittens, and there was a long flat stick of red and white striped peppermint candy, all beautifully notched along each side. They were all so happy they could hardly speak at first. They just looked with shining eyes at those lovely Christmas presents. They got mittens, I got candy. But Laura was happiest of all because Laura had a rag doll. She was a beautiful doll. She had a face of white cloth with black button eyes. A black pencil had made her eyebrows, and her cheeks and her mouth were red with ink made from pokeberries. Her hair was black yarn that had been knit and raveled so that it was curly. She had little red flannel stockings and little black cloth garters for shoes, and her dress was pretty pink and blue calico. Look, there's the whole family, and Laura got a doll. Remember she had the corn cob? She had a corn cob in the other story. She has no corn. She got a real doll instead of a corn cob, and it was, like, cool. She was so beautiful that Laura could not say a word. She just held her tight and forgot everything else. She did not know that everyone was looking at her until Aunt Eliza said, Did you ever see such big eyes? The other girls were not jealous because Laura had mittens and candy and a doll, because Laura was the littlest girl, except baby Carrie and Aunt Eliza's little baby, Dolly Varden. Dolly Varden. Okay. The babies were too small for dolls. They were so small, they didn't even know about Santa Claus. They just put their fingers in their mouths and wriggled because of all the excitement. This is baby Carrie. Laura sat down on the edge of the bed and held her doll. She loved her red mittens and she loved the candy, but she loved her doll best of all. She named her Charlotte. Then they all looked at each other's mittens and tried on their own, and Peter bit a large piece out of his stick of candy, but Alice and Ella and Mary and Laura licked theirs to make it last longer. Well, well, Uncle Peter said, isn't there even one stocking with nothing but a switch in it? My, have you all been such good children? Because he thought it was funny to make a joke about that, to switch, to beat people with in your stocking. Okay, but they didn't believe that Santa Claus could really have given any of them nothing but a switch. That happened to some children, but it couldn't happen to them. It was so hard to be good all the time, every day, for a whole year. You mustn't tease the children, Peter, Aunt Eliza said. Ma said, Laura, aren't you going to let the other girls hold your doll? She meant little girls must not be so selfish. So Laura let Mary take the beautiful doll, and then Alice held her a minute, and then Ella. They smoothed the pretty dress and admired the red flannel stockings and the gaiters, not garters, it's gaiters, full shoes, and the curly woolen hair. But Laura was glad when at last Charlotte was safe in her arms again. Pa and Uncle Peter had each a pair of new warm mittens knit in little squares of red and white. Ma and Aunt Eliza had made them. Aunt Eliza had brought Ma a large red apple stuck full of cloves. Oh, one of those like potpourri things. How good it smelled, and it would not spoil, for so many cloves would keep it sound and sweet. Ma gave Aunt Eliza a little needle book she'd made with bits of silk for covers and soft white flannel leaves into which to stick the needles. The flannel would keep the needles from rusting. It's very important. They all admired Ma's beautiful bracket, and Aunt Eliza said Uncle Peter had made one for her, of course with different carving. Santa Claus had not given them anything at all. Santa Claus did not give grown people presents, but that was not because they had not been good. Pa and Ma were good. It was because they were grown up, and grown people must give each other presents. Then all the presents must be laid away for a little while. Peter went out with Pa and Uncle Peter to do the chores. And Alice and Eliza helped Aunt Eliza make the beds. Laura and Mary set the table while Ma got breakfast. For breakfast, there were pancakes. And Ma made a pancake man for each one of the children. Ma called each one in turn to bring her plate, and each could stand by the stove and watch, while with a spoonful of batter, Ma put on the arms and the legs and the head. It was exciting to watch her turn the whole little man over quickly and carefully on a hot griddle. When it was done, she put it smoking hot on the plate. Peter ate the head off his man right away, but Alice and Ella and Mary and Laura ate theirs slowly in little bits. First the arms and the legs, and then the middle, saving the head for last. It's getting gruesome again, isn't it? Today the weather was so cold that they could not play outdoors, but there were the new mittens to admire and the candy to lick. And they all sat on the floor together and looked at the pictures in the Bible and the pictures of all kinds of animals and birds in Pa's big green book. Laura kept Charlotte in her arms the whole time. Is my candy hard? Look, the candy is hard. Oh, man, that's sweet. That's brutal. Then there was the Christmas dinner. Alice and Ella and Peter and Mary and Laura did not say a word at the table, for they knew that children should be seen and not heard. But they did not need to ask for second helpings. Ma and Aunt Eliza kept their plates full and let them eat all the good things they could hold. Christmas comes but once a year, said Aunt Eliza. Dinner was early because Aunt Eliza, Uncle Peter, and the cousins had such a long way to go. Best the horses can do, Uncle Peter said. We'll hardly make it home before dark. So as soon as they'd eaten dinner, Uncle Peter and Pa went to put the horses to the sled, while Ma and Aunt Eliza wrapped up the cousins. They pulled heavy woolen stockings over the woolen stockings and the shoes they were already wearing. They did. See, they actually, it was like sort of like rain boots. They had on the shoes and socks, and then they put these giant socks over the whole thing. Over the socks they were already wearing. They put on mittens and coats and warm hoods and shawls and wrapped mufflers around their necks and thick woolen veils over their faces. Ma slipped piping hot baked potatoes into their pockets to keep their fingers warm. Did you know you could put a baked potato in your pocket and on a cold day? That's a thing. And Aunt Eliza's flat irons were hot on the stove, ready to put at their feet in the sled. Okay, they had seat warmers, like a fancy car now for seat. They had flat irons and they had potatoes in their pockets. This is awesome. The blankets and the quilts and the buffalo robes were warm too. So they all got into the big bobsled, cozy and warm, and Pa tucked the last robe well in around them. Goodbye, goodbye, they called, and off they went, the horses trotting gaily and the sleigh bells ringing. In just a little while, the merry sound of the bells was gone, and Christmas was over. But what a happy Christmas it had been. And I poured hot molasses and sugar into a pan of crushed ice, like the snow, and it made this thing look, oh my God, good. Now, you think molasses is sweet. But you actually have to add a lot of sugar, like the recipe. It's in the Little House Cookbook, in fact. You have to add sugar because real molasses is harsh. It is just harsh, bitter thing. It is like total prairie goodness. This is awesome. And you can totally make this. It's molasses, sugar, boil pan, make crushed ice, boom, ta-da. That's it. That's the whole. Fantastic. Now, this is awesome. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Hey, should I do another one? Because the next chapter, it's called Sundays. And amazingly, it is actually Sunday today. Sunday. Sundays gets a little weird because, again, 1870s. Sundays. Now, the winter seemed long. It's Minnesota. Laura and Mary began to be tired of staying always in the house, especially on Sundays, when the time went so slowly. Yes, they were tired of being in the house. Just saying. So they found things to do. Every Sunday, Mary and Laura were dressed from the skin out in their best clothes, with fresh ribbons in their hair. They were very clean because they had had their bath on Saturday night. In the summer, they were bathed in water from the spring, but in the wintertime, Pa filled and heaped the wash tub with clean snow. Brrr. And on a cook stove, it melted to water. Then close by the warm stove, behind a screen made of a blanket over 2 chairs, Mary bathed Laura, then she bathed Mary. Ma bathed Laura, then she bathed Mary. So they had hot water. They heated the water up, and they had a whole thing with the fire and the blankets. So it's actually pretty warm. It worked. Laura was bathed first because she was littler than Mary. She had to go to bed early on Saturday nights with Charlotte because after she was bathed and put into her clean nightgown, Pa must empty the wash tub and fill it with snow again for Mary's bath. Then after Mary came to bed, Ma had her bath behind the blanket, and then Pa had his. And then they were all clean for Sunday. So, contrary to popular mythology, no, they weren't all bathing in the same water. And they did bathe normally in the creek, so they were actually pretty darn clean. So there you go. On Sundays, Mary and Laura must not run or shout or be noisy in their play. Mary could not sew on her 9-patch quilt. And Laura could not knit on the tiny mittens she was making for baby Carrie. You couldn't even do that in the sun. You couldn't make mittens. Mittens. Just like too much. They might look quietly at their paper dolls, but they must not make anything new for them. They were not allowed to sew on doll clothes or not even with pins. Work. Because it was work and it was Sunday. They must sit quietly and listen while Ma read Bible stories to them, or stories about lions and tigers and white bears from Pa's big green book, The Wonders of the Animal World. You'd think they'd had quite enough of tigers and bears by now. They might look at pictures, and they might hold their rag dolls nicely and talk to them. But there was nothing else they could do. Laura liked best to look at the pictures in the big Bible with its paper covers. Best of all was the picture of Adam naming the animals. Adam sat on a rock, and all the animals and birds, big and little, were gathered around him, anxiously waiting to be told what kind of animals they were. Adam looked so comfortable. He did not have to be careful to keep his clothes clean because he had no clothes on. He wore only a skin around his middle. Yes, this is seriously in the book. I'm not making this up. Did Adam have good clothes to wear on Sundays? Laura asked Ma. No, Ma said. Poor Adam. All he had to wear was skins. Laura did not pity Adam. She wished she had nothing to wear but skins. It's in a children's book. On Sunday, after supper, she could not bear it any longer. She began to play with Jack, and in a few minutes she was running and shouting. Pa told her to sit in her chair and be quiet, but when Laura sat down, she began to cry and kicked the chair with her heels. I hate Sunday, she said. Pa put down his book. Laura, he said sternly, come here. Her feet dragged as she went because she knew she deserved a spanking. She was very upset. But when she reached Pa, he looked at her sorrowfully for a moment, and then he took her on his knee and cuddled her against him. He held out his other arm to Mary and said, I'm going to tell you a story about when Grandpa was a boy. Now, the last time he told the story, he was 9, he went sent in the woods, he got his toenail torn off and then beaten with a switch. So these stories can get a little Strange. This is the story of Grandpa's sled and the pig that Pa is telling them because he knows it's Sunday morning. When your grandpa was a boy, Laura, Sunday did not begin on Sunday morning as it does now. It began on sundown Saturday night. Then everyone stopped every kind of work or play. Supper was solemn. After supper, Grandpa's father read aloud a chapter of the Bible, while everyone sat straight and still in his chair. Then they all knelt down, and their father said a long prayer. When he said, Amen, they got up from their knees and each took a candle and went to bed. They must go straight to bed, with no playing, laughing, or even talking. Sunday morning, they ate a cold breakfast, because nothing could be cooked on Sunday. Then they all dressed in their best clothes and walked to church. They walked because hitching up the horses was work, and no work could be done on a Sunday. So Laura thinks she has it rough, and Pa's telling her that it was even like when his grandpa. No, this is like you are living in the lap of luxury in the 1870s compared to what Grandpa had to do. They must walk slowly and solemnly, looking straight ahead. They must not joke or laugh or even smile. Grandpa and his two brothers walked ahead, and their father and mother walked behind them. In church, Grandpa and his brothers must sit perfectly still for 2 long hours and listen to the sermon. They dared not fidget on the hard bench. They dared not swing their feet. They dared not turn their heads to look at the windows or the walls or the ceiling of the church. They must sit perfectly motionless and never, for one instant, take their eyes from the preacher. When church was over, they walked slowly home. They might talk on the way, but they must not talk loudly, and they must never laugh or smile. At home, they ate a cold dinner, which had been cooked the day before. Then, all the long afternoon, they must sit in a row on a bench and study their catechism until at last the sun went down and Sunday was over. Now, Grandpa's home was about halfway down the side of a steep hill. The road went from the top of the hill to the bottom, right past the front door, and in winter, it was the best place for sliding downhill that you could possibly imagine. One week, Grandpa and his two brothers, James and George, were making a new sled. They worked at it every minute of their playtime. It was the best sled they had ever made. And it was so long that all 3 of them could sit on it, one behind the other. It was like a bobsled, a Olympic bobsled. They planned to finish it in time to slide downhill Saturday afternoon. For every Saturday afternoon, they had 2 or 3 hours to play. See, they're building sled. There it is. But that week, their father was cutting down trees in the big woods. He was working hard, and he kept the boys working with him. They did all the morning chores by lantern light and were hard at work in the woods when the sun came up. They worked till dark, and then there were the chores to do, and after supper they had to go to bed so they could get up early in the morning. They had no time to work on the sled until Saturday afternoon. Then they worked at it just as fast as they could, but they didn't get it finished till just as the sun went down Saturday night. After the sun went down, they could not slide downhill, not even once. That would be breaking the Sabbath. So they put the sled in the shed behind the house to wait until Sunday was over. All the 2 long hours in church next day, while they kept their feet still and their eyes on the preacher, they were thinking about the sled. At home, while they ate dinner, they couldn't think of anything else. After dinner, their father sat down to read the Bible, and Grandpa and James and George sat as still as mice on their bench with their catechism, but they were thinking about the sled. The sun shone brightly and the snow was smooth and glittering on the road. They could see it through the window. It was a perfect day for sliding downhill. They looked at their catechism and they thought about the new sled, and it seemed that Sunday would never end. After a long time, they heard a snore. They looked at their father and they saw his head had fallen against the back of his chair and he was fast asleep. Then James looked at George, and James got up from the bench and tiptoed out of the room through the back door. George looked at Grandpa, and George tiptoed after James. And Grandpa looked fearfully at their father, but on tiptoe he followed George and left their father snoring. They waited for him to fall asleep, and they snuck out to get the sled. And this is like the late 1700s, so yikes. They took their new sled and went quietly up to the top of the hill. They meant to slide down just once, Then they would put the sled away and slip back to their bench in the catechism before their father woke up. Yeah, sure. James sat in the front of the sled, then George, then Grandpa, because he was the littlest. The sled started at first slowly, then faster and faster. It was running, flying down the long steep hill, but the boys dared not shout. They must slide silently past the house without waking their father. There was no sound except the little whir of the runners on the snow and the wind rushing past. Whoosh, whoosh. Then, just as the sled was swooping toward the house, a big black pig stepped out of the woods. Because, again, bears, pigs, bears, cows, we had panthers, we had wolves, and now, again, pigs. He walked into the middle of the road and stood there. The sled was going so fast it couldn't be stopped. There wasn't time to turn it. The sled went right under the hog and picked him up. With a squeal, he sat down on James, and he kept on squealing, long and loud and shrill. Squee! It says so. Squee! And there is a giant pig. It was like a wild hog, and it's a boar, and it's terrifying. They flashed by the house, the pig sitting in front, and then James and George and Grandpa, and they saw their father standing in the doorway, looking at them. They couldn't stop. They couldn't hide. There was no time to say anything. Down the hill they went, the hog sitting on James and squealing all the way, and saying, "What would you say?" Sorry, I just accidentally picked up a hog. At the bottom of the hill they stopped. The hog jumped off James and ran away into the woods, still squealing. The boys walked slowly and solemnly up to the hill. They put the sled away. They sneaked into the house and slipped quietly to their places on the bench. Their father was reading his Bible. He looked up at them without saying a word. Then he went on reading, and they studied their little catechism. But when the sun went down and the Sabbath day was over, and their father took them out to the woodshed and tanned their jackets. That's what it says. Tanned their jackets. First James, then George, then Grandpa. Ow. So you see, Laura and Mary, Pa said, you may find it hard to be good, but you should be glad that it isn't as hard to be good now as it was when Grandpa was a boy. Did little girls have to be as good as that? Laura asked, and Ma said, oh, it was harder for little girls, because they had to behave like little ladies all the time, not only on Sundays. Little girls could never slide downhill like boys. Little girls had to sit in the house and stitch on samplers. Now run along and let Ma put you to bed, said Pa, and he took his fiddle out of its box. Laura and Mary lay in their trundle bed and listened to the Sunday hymns, for even the fiddle must not sing the weekday songs on Sunday. No. Rock of Ages, cleft for me, Pa sang, with the fiddle. And then he sang, shall I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas. Again, gory things here. Laura began to float away on the music, and then she heard a clattering noise, and there was Ma by the stove getting breakfast. It was Monday morning, and Sunday would not come again for a whole week. That morning when Pa came in to breakfast, he caught Laura and he said he must give her a spanking. He had to put off the beatings till the next day. First he explained that today was her birthday, and she would not grow properly next year unless she had a spanking. And then he spanked so gently and carefully that it did not hurt a bit. It was the birthday spanking, which is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he counted, and spanked slowly. One spank for each year, and the last one, a big spank to grow on. So that's much better than the thing with getting out the switch. Much better, okay. Then Pa gave her a little wooden man he'd whittled out of a stick to be company for Charlotte. Ma gave her 5 little cakes, one for each year that Laura had lived with her and Pa. And Mary gave her a new dress for Charlotte. Mary had made the dress herself when Laura thought she was sewing on her patchwork quilt. And that night, for a special birthday treat, Pa played Pop Goes the Weasel for her. Yes, that song is that old. This is like way awesome. He sat with Laura and Mary close against his knees while he played. Now watch. Watch, and maybe you can see the weasel pop out this time. He sang, a penny for a spool of thread, another for a needle. That's the way the money goes. Laura and Mary bent close, watching, for they knew now was the time. Pop! said Pa's finger on the string. Goes the weasel, sang the fiddle, plain as plain. But Laura and Mary hadn't seen Pa's finger make the string pop. Please, please, do it again, they begged him. Pa's blue eyes laughed, and the fiddle went on while he sang. All around the cobbler's bench, the monkey chased the weasel. The preacher kissed the cobbler's wife. Pop goes the weasel. Wait, what? What? We just said the preacher kissed the cobbler's wife. Children's book. Okay. They hadn't seen Pa's finger that time either. He was pretty slick. He was so quick they could never catch him. So they went laughing to bed and lay listening to Pa and the fiddle singing. And then he sings a song that apparently was popular in the 1870s. However, unfortunately, it has a bad word, well, a couple bad words. You see, in the 1870s, it was not long after slavery. And people had these things they thought were really good ideas in the 1870s that we now would say, no, that's a terrible idea. And apparently, at the time, he thought it was a good idea to sing a totally racist, really mean song on a Monday night to put the kids to bed. And it's just, no, I ain't saying that. We don't say those words. It's like right there. Because Laura, when she wrote these books, even in the 30s, it was about the shocking contrast between now and long ago. Even in the 1930s, there were people who saw this song and went, I beg your pardon? Did you see, what did you just say? Even then. So now, again, we are relieved that we do not live actually in the 1800s, and that we now know not to throw ourselves off a tree stump, face first into the rocky ground covered with snow. We do not touch the molten lead bullets with our bare fingers, and we don't say mean, terrible, racist things in songs to children. I will cheer us up because there's a short one, and yes, it's more bears, because we need bears now to make us feel better, because Pa just sang a racist song and made everyone feel terrible. So now, 2 big bears. Let's hope nobody gets eaten. Then one day, Pa said that spring was coming. Oh, thank heavens. In the big woods, the snow was beginning to thaw. Bits of it dropped from the branches of the trees and made little holes in the softening snowbanks below. At noon, all the big icicles along the eaves of the little house quivered and sparkled in the sunshine, and drops of water hung trembling at their tips. Pa said he must go to town to trade the furs of the wild animals he had been trapping all winter. So one evening, he made a big bundle of them. There were so many furs that when they were packed tightly and tied together, they made a bundle almost as big as Pa. That's a lot of fur. Trading furs. Very early one morning, Pa strapped the bundle of furs on his shoulders and started to walk to town. There were so many furs to carry that he could not take his gun. And and this is still in the big woods. This is before the part of the show when he had a wagon and life was a little easier. He's walking. Ma was worried, but Pa said that by starting before sunup and walking very fast all day, he could get home again before dark. Because as we've established, then it's bears and panthers and wolves and again, wild animals. The nearest town was far away. Laura and Mary had never seen a town. They had never seen a store. They had never seen even 2 houses standing together. But they knew that in a town there were many houses and a store full of candy and calico and other wonderful things, powder and shot and salt and sugar. They knew that Pa would trade his furs to the storekeeper for beautiful things from town, and all day they were expecting the presents he would bring them. When the sun sank low above the treetops and no more drops fell from the tips of the icicles, they began to watch eagerly for Pa. The sun sank out of sight and the woods grew dark, and he did not come. Ma started supper and set the table, but he did not come. It was time to do the chores, and still he had not come. Ma said that Laura might come with her while she milked the cow. Laura could carry the lantern. So Laura put on her coat, and Ma buttoned it up, and Laura put her hands into her red mittens that hung by a red yarn string around her neck, while Ma lighted the candle in the lantern. Laura was proud to be helping Ma with the milking, and she carried the lantern very carefully. Its sides were of tin, and places were cut in them for the candlelight to shine through. When Laura walked behind Ma on the path toward the barn, The little bits of candlelight from the lantern leaped all around her on the snow. The night was not yet quite dark. The woods were dark. But there was a grey light on the snowy path, and in the sky there were a few faint stars. The stars did not look as warm and bright as the little lights that came from the lantern. Laura was surprised to see the dark shape of Suki, the brown cow. I told you Suki was the lead cow. Didn't I do it when they were yelling Suki, Suki? Suki, the brown cow, standing at the barnyard gate. Ma was surprised, too. It was too early in the spring for Suki to be let out in the big woods to eat grass. She lived in the barn. But sometimes on warm days, Pa left the door of her stall open so she could come into the barnyard. Now Ma and Laura saw her behind the bars waiting for them. Ma went up to the gate and pushed against it to open it. But it did not open very far because there was Suki standing against it. Ma said, Suki, get over! She reached across the gate and slapped Suki's shoulder. Just then, one of the dancing little bits of light from the lantern jumped between the bars of the gate, and Laura saw long, shaggy, black fur and two little glittering eyes. Suki had thin, short, brown fur. Suki had large, gentle eyes, because Suki was a cat. Ma said, Laura, walk back to the house. So Laura turned around and began to walk toward the house. Ma came behind her. When they had gone part way, Ma snatched her up, lantern and all, and ran. Ma ran with her into the house and slammed the door. And Laura said, Ma, was it a bear? Yes, Laura, Ma said, it was a bear. Laura began to cry. She hung on to Ma and sobbed. Oh, will he eat Suki? No, Ma said, hugging her. Suki is safe in the barn. Think, Laura, all those big heavy logs in the barn walls, and the door is heavy and solid, made to keep bears out. No, the bear cannot get in and eat Suki. Laura felt better then. But he could have hurt us, couldn't he? She asked. He didn't hurt us, Ma said. You were a good girl, Laura, to do exactly as I told you, and to do it quickly without asking why. Ma was trembling, and she began to laugh a little. Do you think, she said, I slapped a bear? Ma slapped a bear. And luckily, when she said, get to the house, Laura did. Then she put on supper on the table for Laura and Mary. Pa had still not come yet. He didn't come. Laura and Mary were undressed, and they said their prayers and snuggled into the trundle bed. Ma sat by the lamp, mending one of Pa's shirts. The house seemed cold and still and strange without Pa. Laura listened to the wind in the big woods. All around the house the wind went crying as though we were lost in the dark and the cold. The wind sounded frightened. Ma finished mending the shirt. Laura saw her fold it slowly and carefully. She smoothed it with her hand. Then she did a thing she had never done before. She went to the door and pulled the leather latch string through the hole in the door so that nobody could get in from outside unless she lifted the latch. She came and took Carrie, all limp and sleeping, out of the big bed. She saw that Laura and Mary were still awake, and she said to them, Go to sleep, girls. Everything is all right. Pa will be here in the morning. Then she went back to her rocking chair and sat there rocking gently and holding baby Carrie in her arms. She was sitting up late, waiting for Pa, and Laura and Mary meant to stay awake too till he came, but at last they went to sleep. In the morning, Pa was there. He had brought candy for Laura and Mary and 2 pieces of pretty calico to make them each a dress. Mary's was a china blue pattern on a white ground, and Laura's was dark red with little golden brown dots on it. Hey, that sounds like Laura's red dress with a little brown pattern on the show. Historical accuracy. Ma had calico for a dress too, and it was brown with a big feathery white pattern all over it. They were all happy because Pa had got such good prices for his furs, he could afford to get them such beautiful presents. The tracks of the big bear were all around the barn, and there were marks of his claws on the walls. But Suki and the horses were safe inside. All that day the sun shone and the snow melted, and the little streams of water ran from the icicles, which all the time grew thinner. Before the sun set that night, their bear tracks were only shapeless marks in the wet, soft snow. After supper, Pa took Laura and Mary on his knees and said he had a news story to tell them. Is this going to be horrible? No, it's okay. This is the story of Pa and the bear in the way. Now, we had a story earlier about a pig in the way, with the pig in the sled. We had a pig in the way, and now we have a bear in the way. When I went to town yesterday with the furs, I found it hard walking in the soft snow. It took me a long time to get to town, and other men with furs had come in earlier to do their trading. The storekeeper was busy, and I had to wait until he could look at my furs. Then we had to bargain about the price of each one. Then I had to pick out the things I wanted to take and trade. So it was nearly sundown before I could even start home. I tried to hurry, but the walking was hard and I was tired. So I had not gone far before night came, and I was all alone in the big woods without my gun. There were still 6 miles to walk, and I came along as fast as I could. The night grew darker and darker, and I wished for my gun because I knew that some of the bears had come out of their winter dens. I had seen their tracks when I went to town in the morning. Bears are hungry and cross at this time of year, you know. They have been sleeping in their dens all winter long with nothing to eat, and that makes them thin and angry when they wake up. I did not want to meet one. Bears wake up in like a bad mood before their coffee, and they have like blood sugar issues, and they will eat you. I hurried along as quick as I could in the dark. By and by the stars gave a little light. It was still black as pitch. The woods were thick, but in the open places I could see dimly. I could see the snowy road ahead a little way, and I could see the dark woods standing all around me. I was glad when I came into an open place where the stars gave me the faint light. All the time I was watching as well as I could for bears. I was listening for the sounds they make when they go carelessly through the bushes. Then I came again into an open place, and there, right in the middle of my road, I saw a big black bear. He was standing up on his hind legs, looking at me. I could see his eyes shine. I could see his pig snout. I could even see one of his claws in the starlight. Ah! My scalp prickled and my hair stood straight up. I stopped in my tracks and stood still. The bear did not move. There he stood, looking at me. I knew it would do no good to try to go around him. Hi! He would follow me into the dark woods where he could see better than I could. I did not want to fight a winter-starved bear in the dark. Oh, how I wished for my gun. I had to pass the bear to get home. I thought that if I could scare him, he might get out of the road and let me go by. So I took a deep breath, and suddenly I shouted with all my might and ran at him, waving my arms. He didn't move. I didn't run very far toward him. I tell you, I stopped, and I looked at him, and he stood looking at me. And I shouted again, and there he stood. I kept on shouting and waving my arms, but he did not budge. Well, it would do me no good to run away. There were other bears in the woods. I might meet one at any time. I might as well deal with this one as with another. One bear is as good as another. Besides, I was coming home to Ma and you girls. I would never get here if I ran away from everything in the woods that scared me. So at last I looked around, and I got a good big club, a solid heavy branch that had been broken from a tree by the weight of the snow in winter. I lifted it up in my hands, and I ran straight at that bear. I swung my club as hard as I could and brought it down bang on his head. And there he still stood, for he was nothing more than a big black burned stump. Pa just spent like 5 pages, half an hour, fighting with a tree stump that he thought was a bear. So there you go. I had passed it on my way to town that morning. It wasn't a bear at all. I only thought it was a bear because I'd been thinking all the time about bears and being afraid I'd meet one. Bears on the brain. It really wasn't a bear at all, Mary asked. No, Mary, it wasn't a bear at all. There I had been yelling and dancing and waving my arms all by myself in the big woods trying to scare a stump. Laura said, ours was really a bear, but we were not scared because we thought it was Suki. Pa did not say anything, but he hugged her tighter. Oh, that bear might have eaten Ma and me all up, Laura said, snuggling closer to him. But Ma walked right up to him and slapped him, and he didn't do anything at all. Why didn't he do anything? I guess he was too surprised to do anything, Laura, Pa said. I guess he was afraid when the lantern shone in his eyes. And when Ma walked up to him and slapped him, he knew she wasn't afraid. Well, you were brave too, Laura said, even if it was only a stump. You thought it was a bear. You'd have hit him on the head with a club if he had been a bear, wouldn't you, Pa? Yes, said Pa, I would. You see, I had to. Then Ma said it was bedtime. She helped Laura and Mary undress and button up their red flannel nightgowns. They knelt down by the trundle bed and said their prayers. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Because people get eaten by bears all the time in here. Ma kissed them both and tucked the covers in around them. They lay there a while looking at Ma's smooth parted hair and her hands busy with sewing in the lamplight. Her needle made little clicking sounds against her thimble, and then the thread went softly swish through the pretty calico that Pa had traded the furs for. Laura looked at Pa, who was greasing his boots. His mustaches and his hair and his long brown beard were silky in the lamplight, and the colors of his plaid jacket were gay. He whistled cheerfully while he worked, and then he sang. Okay, and it's not a horrible song, it's okay. The birds were singing in the morning, and the myrtle and the ivy were in bloom, and the sun o'er the hills was a-dawning. 'Twas then I laid her in the tomb. I can't catch a break with this thing, can I? Just when I thought things were looking up, nobody was singing anything racist, nobody was getting eaten by a bear, nobody was gutting an animal and hanging it from a tree, no one was being beaten with a switch. Things were good. Things were really looking up. And then he sang a song about laying someone in their grave. I don't know why. It was a warm night. The fire had gone to coals on the hearth, and Pa did not build it up. All around the little house in the big woods, there were little sounds of falling snow, and from the eaves, there was the drip, drip of the melting icicles. In just a little while, the trees would be putting out their baby leaves, all rosy and yellow and pale green, and there would be wildflowers and birds in the woods. Then there would be no more stories by the fire at night, but all day long, Laura and Mary would run and play among the trees, for it would be spring. Well, I think we made it through the whole winter. We did. We made it to spring. So tomorrow is Monday, and it'll be chapter 7, The Sugar Snow, which apparently involves bunny rabbits. There'll be bunny rabbits tomorrow. And I'm going to drink some homemade lemonade. And I'm going to leave up a little bit of Christmas decorations because it's just kind of fabulous. And I have a green bonnet. I have different color bonnets like every day. And I have molasses snow candy. And I think we should all be very grateful that it's, the 21st century, not the 1800s, and that really most of us realistically will not get eaten by a bear or have to slap a bear or hit a bear with a stick. And that things are really so much better than like day-to-day life in Laura's time. Thank you. This was fun. This is just this crazy prairie-ness, and I wear bonnets and I eat things, and I'm really enjoying this. You seem to be enjoying it too. I see the gang. It was Belgium. We got Belgium today. We got France. We got America. I did it a little earlier so the Europeans can get it live. But remember, if in your time zone this is the wrong time of day, it stays just up on Facebook, and you can go back and watch it over and over again. It's fine. So I'm going to just keep reading these here books and wearing different color bonnets and making odd prairie things from time to time. And this is what we're going to do for a while. So now, go get some Ma's Good Lye soap and wash your hands and be nice to each other and be good little boys and girls. And there you go. And be good bonnet heads, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye!